GoPros are some of the best action cameras on the market today. Not only are they durable, they're lightweight, they take great videos and photos, but you can take them almost anywhere you want. From any sport, from hiking to biking to backpacking to canyoneering and even more. However, you may not be getting the most out of your GoPro by just using the standard settings. By using the standard settings, you might just be capturing bland video that you're really not going to care about later. Whereas you could be capturing breathtaking footage instead. So in this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to do that, including what settings to change on your GoPro and even how to edit the video later. So let's get into it. So to get as much out of your GoPro as you possibly can, we're going to change some settings in your video options. In order to do that, you can click on the video presets button just right here. And then you can either change one of the presets that you currently have by clicking the pencil icon on the right, or you can always hit the plus button at the bottom to create a new one. But for right now, we'll just change one of them. First thing you want to do is make sure you have the right resolution. So on the left side is the resolution, whereas you have the frames per second on the right. When it comes to resolution, I like to choose the highest option possible because that gives me the most information to work with. For the frames per second, the lowest you can go is 24 frames per second, and that's kind of the most cinematic look. That's what you see in movies and TV and things like that. Whereas 30 frames per second is what you see normally on like YouTube or social media and other things. And then you can click some of these higher options on the left for higher frame rates that you can then slow down later in post if you wanted. Or if you like that higher frames per second look, then go right ahead. But you notice on some of these resolution options that you can't choose certain frames per second. Like for example, this 4K option doesn't allow me to choose 120 and 240 frames per second. So you have to choose a lower resolution like 2.7K or even 1080 in order to access those lower frames per second. But for right now, let's choose 4K at 30 frames per second. Next is your lens. So each GoPro comes with something a little different. So you have Super View, which is the widest option possible. It has that fisheye effect that we're all used to on GoPros and allows you to capture the most area. The next option is wide. It still has that fisheye effect and it is still wide, but it is a little bit more narrower than Super View. Then lastly is the linear option. This is the most straight view that you have that doesn't have fisheye. And I like to go with linear because it doesn't create any distortions or fisheye that I have to later correct in post or I may not want. So go ahead and click linear. Next is hypersmooth. What hypersmooth is GoPro's way of leveling out your footage while you're recording. So if you're going over bumpy areas, it'll actually crop and distort and do its magic in order to produce a very level video. However, I don't like the way that GoPro uses hypersmooth, and I'd rather correct it later in post because I feel that the computer does a better job than it does on the GoPro. So I actually leave hypersmooth completely off so I can do it later in post. So these lower options like low light and zoom and clips, just make sure they're off or not on at all because we don't need those. The section underneath called Pro Tune is the advanced options for GoPro. This is where we can really dig into it and really customize our GoPro. So the first option is bitrate. So what bitrate is how much information is captured and then recorded to your SD card. So for standard, you get the normal amount of stuff, whereas high gets you more information that you can later work with in post. And because we like more information and we like more things to work with, we're going to click on high. Next is your shutter speed. So there's a general rule within shutter speed that whatever frames per second you choose, you should double it for your shutter speed. So for example, we chose 30 frames per second. So if we double that, we get 60. So we want to find an option that's as close to 1/60 as possible. On the GoPro, we actually do have that option for 1/60. So make sure you click on that. There is an option for auto. We don't want to do that at all because the camera then decides based on the light, and then you might get choppy looking footage or it just might look really unnatural to you. So we want to have control over that by selecting which shutter speed we want to use. Next option is white balance. So what white balance does is it changes your video to either look warmer or more orange or cooler, which is blue. And this depends on the environment you're in. I like to set it to native and then I can change it later in post. The next two options are your ISO. What ISO is it will digitally boost the brightness of your video depending on what it's recording. So if it notices that you're in a dark environment, it'll boost your ISO or your brightness. However, when it does this, it introduces digital noise into your video, and you don't want that. Because then if you do that, it'll come out all noisy and doesn't give a good, clear image. What I like to do is set the ISO min or minimum at 100, and then ISO max down to 100 as well. So that means it's just going to sit at 100 the entire time and not change, and it won't introduce any noise at all. Next is your sharpness. What sharpness does on the GoPro is it takes the blacks and makes them more thick, so it gives you a more punchier and real looking image. However, I'm not a fan of how GoPro uses their sharpness because they over sharpen the video quite a bit, and I'd rather do this later in post where I can fine tune it. And so for right now, I actually leave it on low. And you notice when you'll do this, your images will come out a little bit more, I would say, flat. And that's because of the sharpness we're so used to seeing out of videos that come straight out of the GoPro. Next is your color option. This is where it's really fun. So the first option is GoPro color. This is what we're used to seeing out of videos that come straight out of camera. And this has the bright, vivid colors that we're used to. However, it doesn't give us much information to work with afterwards in post. Whereas the second option, flat, actually produces a more gray looking image or video. This is because it records more information that we can later use in post, and we'll show you how later. So for right now, we're going to select flat. And if you're somebody who likes working with audio, you can always change the raw audio to work with MP3 or WAV. So to choose WAV, just click on it and choose high, like I did, or you can choose off to give yourself an MP3. If you don't know what option to go with, just always go with high because that's more information you can work with. However, if you're trying to save some space, just choose off. And then the last option, you can choose to have wind reduction on your audio. I personally go with off because I have plugins that do a better job of that in post-production. However, if you don't like working with audio, I would just recommend turning on wind reduction. And then finally, once you've got your settings in, just go back to the very beginning and you're ready to roll. So one thing to remember about GoPros is that they'll change settings depending on how bright or dark the environment you're filming is. For example, if you're filming in a very bright place, it'll actually turn down your shutter speed so it doesn't capture as much light, or it'll even turn down your ISO. Whereas in darker places, it'll turn up your ISO and even increase your shutter speed. We don't want the GoPro to change settings, because if we have higher ISOs, we're going to get more noise, and if we have different shutter speeds, the footage is going to look a little different. So we don't want that. To help negate this, we can actually use something called an ND filter. So what an ND filter does is it actually stops a certain amount of light from entering the lens. So the ND filters I have with this attachment, they'll just clip right on. By using an ND filter, I can record in brighter places without having to worry about changing the ISO and even the shutter speed. These aren't necessary, but they do really help. After you've recorded all those videos on your GoPro, you'll then want to edit them to get the most out of your footage. While I'll be showing you how to do this on Final Cut Pro, you'll be able to take these steps and do it in any video editing software that you prefer. So once you've imported your video into your editing software, the first thing you're going to want to do is actually play with the colors and also the levels. So for example, you can see based on this video scope that we have a lot of stuff here in the middle, and then we've got a little bit of brights up here. That's probably because of the sky, and then the darks, I would say because of the jeans and also like the coats. So on Final Cut Pro, if you come over here to the color board options, I've already gone through and changed some of the things. Like for example, I've noticed when using flat that GoPro loves to boost the midtones in the exposure, so just bring those down quite a bit. And I changed the highlights and also the shadows a little bit. Then when it comes to saturation, you're going to want to boost some stuff. I've typically found in the highlights, you're going to want to boost stuff, where the middle, like somewhat, and then not so much in the shadows. This helps to create a very dynamic looking video. However, there is a workaround with color grading. You can use something called a LUT, for example, which means it'll apply a predetermined look to your video. That means you could take a flat looking GoPro video and then apply a LUT to it and make it look bright and beautiful. So let's do that. So instead of using this color board, I personally use MLUT, which is just a LUT catalog. Then I come into here. I come to my presets. These are presets I've made. I go to GoPro Flat and then apply it. It looks pretty intense right now, so I actually bring it down quite a bit. I would say to about 70%. And then from there, I can actually I can change some things in my color board, or I can just change things around depending on how things look. So here it is if I were to just manually color grade it using the color board. Whereas if I use a LUT, it looks a lot different. It actually looks more dynamic and cinema-like. For those interested, I'm actually giving away this LUT for free, and you can find the link to it in the description below. After you've applied your LUT or even color graded, the next thing you're going to want to do is actually sharpen your image. Because we took down the sharpness in the GoPro settings, we're going to actually want to bring it back. So if you use your sharpen tool, which you can find in your effects, I've typically found that about 5 is the sweet spot. Between 3 and 5. What you're going to want to do is actually enter in a value. So I put in 5, and then you're going to want to watch it. And just double check to see if it looks natural, and if it does, great. If it doesn't, then you're going to want to adjust accordingly. Like if it's too much, like for example, if I were to be up here, like in 100, you can tell the footage looks really weird. So I'm going to want to bring that down. And then it starts to look better. Obviously at 0, nothing's going to happen, but we'll take it back to 5. Also, something else to keep in mind is that your GoPro footage is not going to look the same as a bigger camera. Because of the different camera sensor sizes, each one's going to look very different depending on what it captures. I even made a whole video regarding different sensor sizes and the pros and cons to each, and you can find that video right here.